Hello everybody, this is 8-Bit Flashback, and today I'm reviewing the Retro Arcade Mini with 520 built-in games. And this is capable of playing all kinds of different systems, such as arcade from CPS1, CPS2, Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, Megadrive, and Nintendo. Plus you can add your own games using a micro SD card. So this runs off of a 32-bit operating system, and it has a 3-inch screen with 320 by 240 resolution, and a rechargeable battery with approximately 5 hours of playing time. And I did get mine from TomTop.com for right around 36 bucks, and if you're interested in getting one of these, I'll make sure to post a link down below. And inside this box, it does come with a couple cables, and this is actually going to be a link cable. So what this is if you have two of these miniature arcade machines, you can actually join these together with this cable and play a couple of the two-player games. Now this seems like a really cool feature, but unfortunately I don't have another miniature arcade to test this out with, so I don't have a whole lot of information about this. Also on the back of the arcade is going to be a micro SD card slot so you can add some more games. Then there's also going to be a mini USB port where you can charge this, and that USB cable is included. And for the button layout, it has 4 different action buttons. It has an A, B, X, and Y. Then it has a select, reset, and start button, and of course the joystick. And that joystick seems to work decent and it responds well, but I would consider this a light duty joystick, and you want to be gentle when you're using this. And just to let you know, this does not come with any extra controllers, nor does it seem to be compatible with any either. And I recently did a review for another Retro Arcade Mini that was the 360-in-1 model, and although these look very similar, they're quite a bit different because this one only plays NES games, and there's no micro SD card slot. And I also did a review on the full-size model, which is actually my favorite one, and it can play the most systems, but it's more than double the price. Okay, let's power this up and quickly go through the menu. You can play games, you can play music, you can play some formats of movies, you can view pictures, you can read ebooks, it has a file browser, and some system settings. And there's not a whole lot inside the settings. You can change the themes to different backgrounds, you can change the clicking sound, and you can change the backlight brightness. And now I'm inside the game menu, and the first option is doubles game, and what that means is the two-player games, and there's 20 of these available, and all these games are actually arcade games. And for the arcade games, it only seems to be compatible with CPS1 and CPS2 ROMs, although the only ROMs I think are on here are CPS1 ROMs. So you can play all of these games in one-player mode, but if you want to play in two-player mode, you will need a separate miniature arcade that's a 520-in-1 and link that together with that link cable to play in two-player mode. And that's all I can really say about that because I don't have the second one to test it out with, so the only thing I can do is just play these in one-player mode. Okay, let's go ahead and try out a game. This is Cadillac and Dinosaurs, and this game actually seems to play alright, but there is some issues with the emulation on the arcade games. I'd say at least half of them seem to have issues with the audio. And I'll talk more about this as we go on in the video, but out of all the systems it does emulate, which would be Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, NES, and arcade games from CPS1 and CPS2, most of them seem to have audio issues except for Game Boy Advance and Super Nintendo. And I'll be covering all these issues as well. And if you want to save a game, we do have the ability to do that using save states. If you push that select and start button at the same time, that will bring up a menu where you can either quit the game, save states, or load states. So how that save state works is anytime when you're playing the game, if you push start and select, and then select save state, it'll go ahead and save the game at whatever point you are in the game. And when you want to return to that point, all you gotta do is push start and select again, and then load that state, and it'll take you right back to the point where you saved the game. And as far as the screen quality goes, it seems to be pretty decent. I can turn it left or right or up and down, and I can still see that screen pretty good, so those viewing angles seem to be pretty nice. And for the resolution, we're only dealing with 320 by 240, but for this small screen playing just retro games, I think it's plenty good enough. Okay, let's now check out the games folder, and that's where the bulk of the built-in games are going to be, and there's going to be 500 games inside here. So let's quickly go through some of these games. So for the Game Boy Advance, you're looking at about 24 games. For the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo, there is 80 games. For the Megadrive or the Sega Genesis, you're looking at 121. And for NES or Famicom, you're looking at about 275. And most of these games are playable, but some have audio issues. So let's go in order, starting with the best emulation. The Game Boy Advance games play the best, followed by Super Nintendo, then Sega Genesis, then NES, and last would be arcade games. But what's weird with the arcade games is half of them have decent audio. And I will be showing gameplay for all these systems to give you a good idea of the emulation quality. And as you can see here for each game, it does give you a thumbnail to give you a preview of that game, so if you're not familiar with it, this kind of gives you an idea of what the game is. Alright, we're almost all the way through the list here, and let's go ahead and try a Game Boy Advance game out. Let's try some Crash Bandicoot. So as I said before, I think the Game Boy Advance has the best emulation on here. I think the audio sounds decent, along with the video and controls. And I do wish there was some more Game Boy Advance games built in, but we do have that micro SD card slot, so we can add as many Game Boy Advance games as we want. And just to let you know, the save states do work for all the games on here. And now I'm just going to let the game play on for a few, and I'm going to show you a couple different Game Boy Advance games, and then we're going to move on to Super Nintendo. And here's Metal Slug Advance. And just to let you know, I've not had time to test all the games on here for each system, but I have had time to test a handful of each, including games on the micro SD card. And as with any emulator, the compatibility is usually never 100%. So expect issues with some games. For instance, Doom for Game Boy Advance is usually a demanding game, and a lot of emulators have a hard time with that game. So there's going to be some games that just don't play properly, and that's just the way it goes usually with emulation. Okay, now we're on to Super Nintendo, and let's try some F-Zero out. And I would say the emulation for Super Nintendo is pretty decent as well. The videos and controls seem to work good, and the audio is not too bad. Now don't get me wrong or misunderstand me when I say it has decent emulation. By no means is this perfect emulation, but I think it's doing a pretty good job for what this is, and I think it's very playable the way it is. Now let's let Super Nintendo play on for just a few here. And this is a game I ran into an issue with when testing Super Nintendo games. This is Robocop vs. Terminator, and this is a built-in game. And when I go to start this game, I just get a flickering screen. So I'm not sure what the problem is, but it doesn't seem to be very playable. And let's try out one more Super Nintendo game. This is R-Type. Okay, now we're on to Sega Genesis, and this is Sonic the Hedgehog. And as you can hear, the audio is not so great, but the video and controls seem to be working fine. And now I'm going to go ahead and show some gameplay for just a few seconds here. So as you can hear, that sound is definitely off, and it seems to be more related to the music. It seems like the sound effects aren't quite so bad, but that music is off for sure. And for this game, Gunstar Heroes, which is actually a pretty demanding game for the Sega Genesis, surprisingly the music's a little bit better sounding, and it's not quite as bad. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this sounds great, it just sounds better than what Sonic did. And here's Miss Pac-Man for the Sega Genesis, and it actually sounds okay as long as there's no music playing. And here is NES, and let's go ahead and try some Super Mario Brothers out. And as you can hear, that sound is not so great, and there is some issues with screen tearing. If you look closely, you can see that screen tearing just a little bit. And here's Super Mario Bros. 3, and it plays about the same way. That music's a little bit off, and there's a little bit of screen tearing. And this is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. And surprisingly, there doesn't seem to be any screen tearing in this, and the audio is a little bit better, but it does seem to be playing just a little bit fast. And I don't want to confuse anyone, but when I said arcade game, that's actually the title or the name of the game, and this is indeed a NES game. But we will be testing some arcade games next. Okay, here is a CPS arcade game, Street Fighter 2, and as you can hear, that audio is not doing so well. And it does seem to be responding and controlling just fine, but that audio is definitely an issue. And this is another CPS game. This is the Punisher, and oddly, the audio seems to be fine on this game. So like I said, it seems to be a mixture of half of these games seem to have audio issues, and the other half don't. Okay, time to test some games out on my micro SD card, and it supports up to 32 GB. And here's something I forgot to mention earlier, but that case is somewhat translucent, so when you have it turned on, the backlight from that screen kind of glows through the case, so I kind of like that feature. And when you add games to that micro SD card, you can either make a folder called Game in all caps and put the games inside there, or you can put the games wherever you want, because you can use that file browser that's on the Retro Arcade to search for the games anywhere on the micro SD card. And now I'm going to try out a couple games from that micro SD card. We'll try out Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo and a couple Game Boy Advance games. So here's my final thoughts on this Retro Arcade Mini on whether it's worth it or not. I think it is, just based off the fact that it plays Game Boy Advance games and Super Nintendo games fairly decent. And you have the ability to play over 1,000 games via the micro SD card slot. Now I know not all the games are compatible, but say even if it was only 90%, that's still well over 1,000 games. And I know a lot of the other systems or emulators do have some audio issues, but there's still a bunch of games mixed in there that are playable. So obviously I stressed the strong points of this, that would be the Game Boy Advance and Super Nintendo, and the other emulators are kind of hit and miss for what games I would consider playable. Now if you're not a fan of Game Boy Advance or Super Nintendo, then this miniature arcade might not be for you. But I'm a huge fan of both of those, and I'm happy with it. And if you like this video, don't forget to click that like button and subscribe, and have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.